Right now, somewhere in the Kalahari Desert, a small group of people is waking up with no alarm clock, no to-do list, and no idea what time it is. And yet, in about 4 hours, they'll be done working for the day. For the rest of the afternoon, they'll rest, they'll gossip, they'll tell stories, they'll nap in the shade. Meanwhile, you're reading this on a screen, probably during a 15-minute break in a 10-hour day, wondering how you're going to get everything done before tonight. Here's the uncomfortable question this video is going to answer. Who's actually living the harder life, you or them? Because for over a century, we've told ourselves a story about our ancestors, that life before agriculture, before cities, before clocks, was nasty, brutish, and short, a constant grinding fight for survival from sunrise to sunset. That story is wrong, and the truth about what ancient humans actually did all day is stranger, more surprising, and more uncomfortable than almost anyone expects. The central question. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. For about 95% of that time, every single human on Earth lived as a hunter-gatherer. No farms, no offices, no Sunday scaries, no overtime. Which means the normal human life, the one written into our bodies, our brains, our sleep cycles, our stress responses, isn't the one most of us are living now. It's theirs. So if you want to understand why you feel exhausted after 8 hours at a desk, why you crave connection you can't quite find, why silence makes you uneasy and constant notifications feel oddly normal, you have to go back. Not to imagine a struggle, but to watch an actual day unfold, hour by hour, the way it did for thousands of generations before you. Sunrise, the myth of the endless hunt. The sun is barely over the horizon. The air is still cool. You'd expect the hunters to already be moving, spears in hand, chasing down breakfast like it's a race against starvation. They're not. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee spent months living among the Jew hoansi people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last populations on Earth still living a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. He expected to document a brutal, food-scarce existence. Instead, he found something that stunned him. Adults worked an average of about 15 to 20 hours a week to meet their basic food needs. 15 to 20 hours, not 15 to 20 hours a day, a week. The rest of the time was spent resting, socializing, playing, and doing what Lee's colleague, the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins, would later call something almost blasphemous for the time. He called it the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had more stuff, affluent because they wanted less and got it easily. But that raises an obvious question. If they weren't working, what were they actually doing with the other 150 hours of the week? That's where the story gets interesting. Mid-morning, the work that didn't feel like work. By mid-morning, a small group sets out. Not everyone, not even most people. Hunting in most gathering societies was often a minority activity, and gathering, done largely by women, provided the majority of daily calories in many documented groups, sometimes 60 to 80% of the diet. This alone breaks the caveman with a club image most of us grew up with. The hunt wasn't a desperate chase, it was patient, skilled. Sometimes it involved tracking an animal for hours, reading footprints, broken twigs, and disturbed dirt like a detective reads a crime scene. Anthropologist Louis Liebenberg, studying modern-day trackers in southern Africa, argued that this kind of tracking may have been one of the very first forms of scientific reasoning in human history, forming a hypothesis from evidence, testing it, revising it as new signs appeared. In other words, before there were scientists in labs, there were trackers in the sand doing something remarkably similar. But here's the twist nobody expects. Most days, the hunt failed. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups suggest large game hunts often came back empty-handed, sometimes the majority of the time, and yet nobody starved. Why? Because of what was happening back at camp. Midday, the safety net no one talks about. While a few hunted, others gathered roots, nuts, berries, and tubers, reliable, steady sources of food that didn't depend on luck. This is where the myth completely collapses. Ancient survival wasn't about one person's strength or one hunter's skill. It was a web of dozens of people who all owed each other something. Anthropologists call this sharing economies, and in many documented societies, meat from a successful hunt wasn't kept by the hunter, it was distributed, sometimes according to strict, almost ritualized rules, across the entire band. Imagine depending on 25 people for every meal you ever eat. Now imagine, instead of feeling like a burden, it felt like the only reasonable way to live, because next week when you come back empty-handed, they'll feed you too. There's a phrase some researchers use to describe this: insurance against bad luck. Except there were no insurance companies, no contracts, no bank accounts, just relationships, reputation, reciprocity. And this, not the hunt, not the fire, not even the tools, may be the real reason humans survived when so many other species didn't. Afternoon, the hours history forgot. By early afternoon, most of the work of the day is already finished, and this is where the story gets almost unbelievable to modern ears. People rested, not out of laziness, out of design. Sahlins pointed out that hunter-gatherers didn't accumulate surplus because surplus was often a burden in a mobile lifestyle. More to carry, more to lose, more to defend. Without the drive to constantly stockpile, there was little reason to keep working once needs were met. So the afternoon became something we barely have a word for anymore: unstructured time. Children played, and researchers studying groups like the Hadza of Tanzania have observed that this play often doubled as skill building, teaching tracking, plant identification, and social rules without anyone calling it school. Adults told stories, and this detail changes everything we think we know about ancient conversation. A study led by anthropologist Polly Wiesner analyzed recorded Jew-Hoansi conversations and found that daytime talk was mostly practical, logistics, complaints, economic matters, but nighttime talk was different. 60% of firelit conversations were stories, myths, gossip about far-off people, tales that stretched imagination beyond the small, familiar world of the camp. Wiesner argued that firelight itself may have changed human cognition, extending the day into a space for culture, meaning, and imagination that simply didn't exist under the harsh practicality of daylight. Which means the campfire wasn't just for warmth, it might have been humanity's first theater. Evening, the ritual we've almost lost. As the sun sets, the group gathers. This is the part most documentaries skip because it doesn't look like survival, it looks like something closer to community. Grooming rituals, shared meals, singing, storytelling, even dancing appear across nearly every documented hunter-gatherer society on Earth. Some researchers, including anthropologist Robin Dunbar, have argued that these social bonding behaviors weren't a luxury layered on top of survival, they were survival. Dunbar's research suggests that the size of human social groups may be directly tied to the size of our brains, that staying connected to roughly 150 people wasn't a hobby, it was a biological necessity, as important as food or shelter. In other words, loneliness might be one of the oldest threats to human survival there is, and by that measure, a modern person scrolling alone through a feed at 11 p.m., liked by thousands of strangers and known intimately by almost none of them, is missing something our ancestors built their entire evenings around. The sleep nobody expected. Here's where it gets stranger. You'd assume ancient humans slept in one long, unbroken block, exhausted from a hard day's labor. But sleep researcher Jerome Siegel studied 3 modern hunter-gatherers and forager-horticulturalist groups, the Hadza, the San, and the Tisane, and found something that upended decades of assumptions. They slept on average about 6.5 hours a night, not 9, not 10, 6.5, roughly in line with, or even slightly less than the average modern adult. They rarely napped, they didn't go to bed at sunset, many stayed up for hours after dark, around the fire, and almost none of them reported symptoms of chronic insomnia, a condition affecting a significant percentage of people in industrialized nations today. The difference wasn't how much they slept, it was how connected their bodies were to actual darkness, actual temperature drops, actual physical exhaustion, signals that modern life, wrapped in artificial light and climate control, has quietly erased. The comparison that changes everything. Today, the average full-time worker in the United States spends around 8 to 9 hours a day working, plus commuting, plus chores, plus the low hum of always being reachable. Thousands of years ago, the workday for many hunter-gatherer groups may have been shorter than a modern part-time job. Today, we eat meals in isolation, staring at screens. Thousands of years ago, nearly every meal was a shared social event, wrapped in conversation and ritual.